Good morning, everyone, data nerds and non-data nerds alike. We welcome all comers here at our Kids Count presentations. I'm really excited to be back in Grand County. As Megan mentioned, it's been a couple of years since we've been here sharing our Kids Count data. And so I'm super excited to come back this year with, as Kelly mentioned, a Kids Count that is very, very different from years past. We like to keep it fresh at the Children's Campaign. And so I think there are some similarities. You'll still find in the back your county data pages that have almost 40 different indicators of how kids are doing in your community that you can compare to the statewide average and to other surrounding communities on everything from child poverty to health insurance to high school graduation rates. But as Kelly noted in her introduction, the rest of the report is very different. And I'll give you just a little bit of an explanation of why we did things differently this year. Kelly touched on the fact that for the past couple of years, the Children's Campaign has been doing a lot of work on diversity and inclusion and equity, and specifically racial and ethnic equity. And we've been doing this work both internally, so really trying to diversify our staff and our board and our networks to make sure that we're hearing from a group of people that reflects what the state of Colorado really looks like. And then we've also been doing some work externally to really think about how do we better work toward more equitable opportunities and outcomes for Colorado's kids. Because I think that we can all agree that in 2017, it really should not be possible to predict the likelihood of a child's ability to attend a high quality preschool program or predict their ability to see a doctor when they need to based on the color of that child's skin. But the reality is that currently that is possible. We have seen for a long time here in Colorado really big gaps in children's opportunities and in how children are doing, and those gaps oftentimes, too often, fall along racial and ethnic lines. And we've highlighted these gaps for many years in our Kids Count reports. We've long reported on things like the achievement gap or the differences in uninsured rate for different groups of children. But what we haven't always done the best job of is explaining why those gaps exist. And that wasn't because we didn't think the why was important. It really was, if we're being completely honest, because we weren't the experts on why. A lot of the time we didn't have an answer when we were asked, why is the uninsured rate so much higher for Latino children or American Indian children than it is for white children, or what really is driving the achievement gap between different groups of students. And I think when you don't explain the why behind these gaps that we see, you leave things open for people to kind of interpret things in their own way, and a lot of times those are informed by those implicit biases that we all have in our heads. And so when we're thinking about correcting those disparities, having that understanding of what's creating them is really, really critical if we're going to come up with strategies to address them. So this year we wanted to be very, very intentional about explaining how we got to where we are today and how we got to where we see these different outcomes for kids based on the color of their skin or the language that they speak. And luckily, we didn't have to come up with that why on our own. We invested a lot of time and resources in preparation for this year's Kids Count to going out into communities across the state and talking to families and young people about things that have served as barriers for them or things that have served as opportunities and really given them a boost. So we went to 4 different communities across the state. We would have loved to have done more, but that's kind of what our time and resources would allow for. So we went to Durango in southwestern Colorado. We went to Denver to kind of capture the metro area perspective. We spent some time down in the San Luis Valley in Alamosa, and then also up in the northeastern part of the state in Fort Morgan, and really talked to people about what they saw as being the driving factors behind these gaps in child well-being in their community. Unfortunately, we didn't have one here in kind of the rural resort Central Mountain region, so I'll be really interested to hear from you guys what you see as the driving factors behind gaps in child well-being. But we really, really learned so much from these community members across the state about some of the policies and some of the practices that have served as barriers for all kids, but in many cases, children of color. And so we'll kind of walk through what we heard from community members across the state, and then also, whenever possible, we'll zero in on some of the data for Grand, Jackson, and Routt counties so that you can see what the numbers look like for your community. So you'll see the community input that we got from our outreach process this year in a lot of places throughout the report, both in some different quotes that we pulled out and then also just in kind of the explanations that we give of a lot of the issues that we touch on this year. All of those are really informed by the folks that we talked to across the state. And I wanted to start with a quote from a community member who participated in this process that I thought really summed up well the main focus or takeaway of Kids Count this year. And so this person said, "Our lives are impacted both personally and communally by both things that happen to us as individuals and then also as a people." I think a lot of the time when we think about how we ourselves got to where we are today or how our families got to where we are today, a lot of the time when we're reflecting back, we think about our own individual choices or our parents' choices or individual level opportunities. We don't often think about those big, large scale things like policies and practices that really have shaped where all of us are and that really are responsible for those gaps in child well-being that we see. So we might not think about things like the Americans with Disabilities Act and all of the opportunities that that has provided for us or for someone in our family, or how the Affordable Care Act has shaped our lives. But in addition to those individual choices that we're all making, there are these really big kind of systems level issues that are impacting all of us and that are impacting the opportunities that are available to us today. So I just kind of wanted to frame this conversation by saying that when we talk about these differences in child well-being, those are really due to policies and practices. They're not usually due to differences in individual choices or the choices of any particular groups. I just thought this was a really nice way of summing up that we're really all connected and all influenced by these bigger issues. So with that, we'll go ahead and dive into the data and some of the community feedback that we heard. And we'll start with family economic security. So Kelly mentioned that our 3 core issue areas of the Children's Campaign are early childhood learning and development, child health, and K-12 education. But we also pay a lot of attention to family economic security because we know that a family's economic circumstances impact all of those things, right? If a family is living in poverty, that often affects their access to health care, their access to healthy food, the child's ability to pay attention in school. And so we track data on family economic security very, very closely, in addition to data on those other 3 issue areas that we work on. And one thing that we heard a lot about, particularly when we were talking about differences in economic opportunity by race and ethnicity, was the impact of housing. So housing and home ownership has been a very important part of American families' ability to kind of build wealth and build wealth that can be passed down from generation to generation. And a lot of the disparities that we see today can really be traced back to differences in the opportunity to own a home or differences in the opportunity to live in certain areas. And so we heard a lot about this kind of housing discrimination and housing segregation from people across the state when we were talking about disparities in family economic security. And we had one participant who mentioned, and this person happened to be in the Denver focus group, but we heard this from different communities around the state. This person mentioned, "They told my father that our family could not live east of Colorado Boulevard." This was in the 50s. My father was like, "You can't tell me where I can live." So in 1962, they opened up where Blacks could live east of Colorado Boulevard, and I was raised in the Park Hill neighborhood of Denver, which was at the time and still kind of a more affluent neighborhood. It was a big difference to us on the east side of Colorado Boulevard and our economics as opposed to those that lived on the west side. And we heard a lot of this about how housing and kind of neighborhood context really influenced the opportunities that were available to families many, many years ago, and how the effects of those policies and practices are still really being felt today. And I'll just give you one quick example, and I don't mean to be so Denver-centric. It just happens that this is where the Denver Public Library has a lot of information on this topic, and so that's kind of the information that we were able to get. But what I'm about to talk about was really happening all across the country. And that topic is redlining. So how many people are already familiar with the concept of redlining? A couple of people. I wasn't super familiar with it before we started this process either, because it's really not something that we're all taught in school. It's not, common knowledge that we learn about in our history classes. So just to give a brief background, back in the early 1930s, the Federal Housing Housing Administration started backing long-term, low-interest home loans for American families so that they could get a mortgage and buy a home and kind of move into the middle class. And these loans served as a gateway into the middle class for millions of American families. Because again, if your family is able to purchase a home and keep that home, that's something that parents can then pass on to their children that can serve as an asset and help people build wealth over time. So that those loans were very, very important to a lot of us probably in this room, to our families many generations ago. However, unfortunately, these loans weren't always available to everyone. There was a group of lenders called the Home Ownership Loan Corporation that got together and kind of mapped out areas of the United States and color-coded these maps to illustrate areas that were deemed fit for investment. These are areas where they would grant people mortgages, and then areas that were deemed unfit for investment or hazardous. Now, ostensibly, these areas were, color codes were based on creditworthiness. But looking back, when people rediscovered these maps, they discovered that they were really, in reality, based more on the racial and ethnic makeup of a community, how many immigrants were living in that community, for example, and not as much on the economic circumstances of people in that community. And so they drew these maps and color-coded them. The blue and green areas of the maps are those that were considered fit for investment. And again, this is a map of Denver. You see neighborhoods like Park Hill, the Country Club neighborhood, that were deemed fit for investment. The neighborhoods that were primarily home to folks of color, so the Five Points area of the city, the southwestern part of the Denver that's long been home to many Latino families, those areas were redlined, shaded in red, and people who lived in those areas would have had a very, very hard time getting a mortgage, if they could get one at all, to either purchase a home or to be able to make improvements to their homes or businesses. So as a result of this redlining, we had millions of Americans, primarily people of color or immigrants, who were completely shut out of the opportunity to purchase a home, even if they would have qualified based on their economic circumstances. And of course, again, in the United States, home ownership is one of the biggest ways that we build wealth. And so when you exclude millions and millions of people from the opportunity to build that wealth, you're going to see wealth disparities that then continue to get passed on from generation to generation to generation. And that is something that we heard about frequently in our conversations as well. So we had a participant mention one thing that stood out for me that drives disparity is that a lot of people of color don't have what's called generational wealth, where the parents, when they pass on, they leave $100,000 or they leave a college fund. What ends up happening is you have families that literally every generation starts over. And when we look at the numbers, we see that they bear out the experience of this particular person who's quoted here. So this is a graph, that shows household wealth, which is assets, so everything you own minus your debts, by race and ethnicity in the United States in 2011. And you can see that the gap between white Americans and then especially Black and Latino Americans is enormous. And there's been a lot of research to show that what the primary drivers of the wealth gap are. So they've looked at if you control for things like a family's educational attainment, does that correct for the wealth gap? The answer is no, it doesn't. If you look at whether a family is working full-time, does that correct for the wealth gap? No, it doesn't. The biggest things that are driving this wealth gap, according to the research, are gaps in that kind of intergenerational wealth and the money that's passed down, or the homes that are passed down from parents that were afforded these opportunities generations ago. So again, sometimes we like to think that the problems that we're dealing with now are a result of, only things that are happening now in many cases, and in some cases they are being driven by current policies and practices, but in many cases the roots of these disparities run very, very deep, and they've been felt now for many, many generations of Colorado kids and families. But moving to more current times, one thing that we always discuss in Kids Count is the child poverty rate, because we know, again, if a child or a family is living in poverty, that's impacting every other aspect of their life. So we did have some good news when it came to child poverty in Kids Count this year, which is nice. If you were at our last Kids Count presentation a couple of years ago, you probably didn't hear much good news in this area. But we have started to see Colorado's child poverty rate start to go back down in the years after the recession. So for many years, we were seeing increase after increase after increase in the percent of kids who are living in poverty. In 2015, which is the most current data that we have, we saw Colorado's child poverty rate decline for the third year in a row. So we're now down to 15%, so back to our pre-recession level as a state. But that 15% still represents more than 190,000 kids across the state that are living in families with incomes below the poverty line. I know we have a lot of folks in the room that work with kids and families and are probably already familiar with what poverty means. If you're not familiar with it, just to kind of really paint the picture for you about what that means. Poverty is defined as an annual income of less than $24,000 a year for a family of four. Now, if you can imagine trying to live on $24,000 a year for a family of four, 2 children, maybe they need to be in childcare, especially in this area of the state where housing costs and the cost of living are very high, that's going to be very, very difficult, if not completely impossible for a family to do. And so that 15% of kids statewide is definitely an underestimate of the number of kids that are living in economically struggling families. Because if we have a family in Grand County that's making $25,000 a year for a family of four, that family is not even counted in these poverty numbers because of the way that the federal government defines poverty. So just something important to keep in mind. If we look at what's happened here in this region of the state, in Jackson, Grand, and Routt counties, we can see that these counties have also experienced some declines in their child poverty rates, particularly since 2013. But unlike the state, Grand and Routt counties have not seen their child poverty rates get back to that pre-recession level. And that's something that we've heard about a lot when we've come to the kind of rural resort regions, is that folks feel like things have never really gotten completely back to where they were before the economic downturn hit. Does that seem to resonate with what you all feel like you're seeing here? Yeah, particularly not even just rural resort, but a lot of rural communities across the state feel like they have not been able to rebound the way that maybe the Denver metro area has rebounded in recent years. So really important to keep considering how we can all support kids and families and being able to make ends meet given these numbers. So these are the overall child poverty rates. Again, this year's Kids Count is kind of focused on those racial and ethnic disparities and how kids are doing. So we also break down the poverty rate by race and ethnicity. We'll look at Colorado first, and then we'll look at Grand County. This is a graph that shows the poverty rate for Colorado kids under 18 broken down by race and ethnicity over a 5-year time period. We kind of have to look at a broader time period because when we're breaking things down by race and ethnicity, the numbers get really small. So we do this to make the data more reliable. But here you see tremendous disparities in a child's likelihood of being affected by poverty. So across the state of Colorado, about 9% of non-Hispanic white children are living in poverty. Compare that to 35% of American Indian Alaska Native children, 33% of African American children across the state. And again, these differences are in large part due to many of those policies that have been implemented over the years that have affected different groups of kids and families very, very differently. We can also take a look to an extent at what these disparities look like in Grand County. Grand County is a smaller geography, and then it's also not quite as diverse as the rest of the state, so we're not able to get child poverty rates for kids of all races and ethnicities. But we can look at them for white children in Grand County and then Hispanic children in Grand County, and you see that the pattern looks very similar. So Hispanic children here in Grand are twice as likely as white children to be affected by poverty as a result of some of these policies and practices that we've discussed today. And we know that even when we're looking just at kids who live in poverty, poverty often looks very different for kids of color and white children. And this graph kind of has a lot going on, so I'll walk you through it here. This is a graph that shows the percent of kids whose own families are in poverty who are also living in a high poverty neighborhood or a high poverty community. High poverty communities are defined as those where at least 30% of all people living there are in poverty. And this matters because there's a lot of research that shows that neighborhoods or communities have a huge impact on child well-being, which makes sense. If you have safe parks and playgrounds in your communities, nice places to play outside, if you're able to get to a doctor fairly easily or to a grocery store, your opportunities are going to be very, very different from a child who might be more isolated from those things. And so if you're a child whose own family is poor, who's also living in a poor neighborhood, you're kind of at a double disadvantage. So it's really troubling that here in Colorado, we see children of color, and particularly American Indian, Black, Asian, and Pacific Islander children being 3 times as likely to live in these high poverty neighborhoods as white children. So even when we're looking at kids that are all at the same income level, we see differences in opportunity. White children are much more likely to live in mixed income or more affluent neighborhoods, even when their own family is poor, which of course gives them more access to those things that we know kids and families need. But even when we look at kids whose own families are not living in poverty, we still see big differences here. So that's what this green line represents here. And you can see that if you're an American Indian child in Colorado, I'm going to move over a little bit, an American Indian child whose family is not poor, you are still more likely to live in a high poverty neighborhood than a white child whose family is poor. So we see inequities and disparities in opportunity even among kids who are at kind of similar income levels here, which again is going to impact their opportunity to access a lot of important resources. Any questions on child poverty or family economic security or any of the policies that we talked about? Do you feel like you see these disparities here in Grand County? Seeing lots of nods. What do you think are there any reasons specific to Grand County that you feel like that might be impacting those numbers or might be creating those disparities?
I think sheer distance for both Green and Jackson. It's an hour anywhere at the best.
Yeah, so oftentimes
there are families that are for housing, and I'd be interested to know if rural communities have the same red line mapping, but for housing, if they're, depending on where they are, the affordable housing is out further than the services. So I think just that geographical distance is really a challenge.
that makes a lot of sense. And if you're a family that's living in affordable housing, oftentimes you often have transportation barriers as well, which can make it very hard to get into town or get to those resources for kids and families. That's a great point.
I think not only just the cost of housing, of the physical structure, it's the cost of utilities. We joke that it's winter 10 months a year up here, and so when you're cranking the heat or we're just trying to stay warm.
Yeah, so that's an added barrier that people in other parts of the state might not necessarily feel at that same intensity. That's a great point.
I think also the seasonal work. There's work in the summer and there's work in the winter, but we have mud season, so there's not a consistent income for a lot of low-income families.
Yeah, that makes it really hard if it's kind of feast or famine and you don't have that consistency to get you through the year. Absolutely.
And I find it interesting too what they consider affordable housing. It's like, are you kidding me? Yeah. I mean, I don't understand how some families can afford affordable housing.
I know, we've heard that in other rural resort communities too, especially around attracting teachers to come and live in the community, because we all know that teachers are not making the big bucks, and so oftentimes it's really hard in communities where the cost of housing is very high to attract people for those positions. And I heard one community where affordable housing could be up to $1 million, and good luck being a teacher and affording $1 million house. It's going to be tough. Great. Awesome. Well, please keep those that local context coming, because as I mentioned, this wasn't an area of the state that we were able to visit when we were putting together this year's Kids Count. And it's, I feel like, a big hole in our information because we don't have that kind of rural resort community feedback here. So please keep jumping in with that info. So we'll move on and talk a little bit about race, ethnicity, and health. And we'll start with health coverage, where again, we have some good news here. So Colorado historically, several years ago, did not do a very good job of insuring our children, particularly when we compared ourselves to other states and to the national average. So you can see here, back in 2008, 14% of our kids were uninsured, compared to about 10% of kids across the United States. So over the next several years, there were some policy changes made both here at the state level, things like expanding the Child Health Plan Plus to serve more families, for example, making programs like Medicaid and CHIP Plus a little bit more efficient for families to enroll in and to use. And then also, of course, we had the Affordable Care Act at the federal level, which expanded Medicaid, or at least here in Colorado, expanded Medicaid for adults, which resulted in a lot of kids getting signed up for Medicaid too, because we know that when parents have health coverage, their kids are more likely to be covered too. So a lot of these policy changes work together to really make a dent in the number of uninsured kids across the state of Colorado. And we saw in 2015, which again is the most recent information that we have, our uninsured rate here as a state was at a record low of 4.2%. So just to put this in terms of real kids, to kind of give you an idea of the magnitude of this change, that's 120,000 kids who gained access to health coverage during that time period. Now we know that access to health coverage doesn't always guarantee access to health care. There's still affordability to worry about. You might not have a provider in your community that accepts your insurance, but we do know that coverage is kind of that first step to getting kids the care that they need. So it's encouraging to see these numbers improving so much over the last several years as a result of these big policy changes that we've seen. But health insurance is also an example of how, although a rising tide might lift all boats, it doesn't necessarily correct the underlying racial and ethnic disparities that we see. And so you can see here, these are uninsured rates for Colorado kids broken down by race and ethnicity in 2009, and then the darker purple bar is 2015. And if you look across kids of different races and ethnicities, you'll see that the uninsured rate really did plummet in a lot of cases for everybody. But we still have some groups of kids that are more likely to be uninsured than others. You can see here, for example, that the uninsured rate for Latino children in Colorado is almost twice as high as the rate for white children. The uninsured rate for kids of some other race, which oftentimes the Census Bureau has found are kids who identify as Hispanic and Latino, but weren't included in that box for some reason, that's also much higher than normal, and then a much higher rate for our American Indian and Alaska Native families as well. And so this was something that we asked about when we did our community outreach. And one thing that we heard about everywhere was the impact of immigration and documentation status in particular. So the vast majority of Latino kids in Colorado are US citizens. They were born here, they qualify for programs like Medicaid and CHIP Plus or subsidies through the healthcare exchange. But oftentimes, kids are living in families where another family member might not be a citizen and might be undocumented. And we heard from families across the state that there really is a lot of fear when it comes to interacting with these public programs like Medicaid and CHIP Plus. So even if the child is a citizen and qualifies, that child might be living in a family where the mom lacks documentation and therefore is a little bit afraid to go in and provide the child's information and get signed up for these programs. And so we're trying to think a lot about, yes, we've made great progress in covering 120,000 kids over the last several years, but how do we really focus on the last 50,000 kids across the state who lack health insurance coverage, who in many times are facing the most barriers, and very specific barriers like immigration status. So that's kind of one of the things we'll be thinking about for our policy agenda in the coming years.
I just have a question.
Sure.
American Native and Alaska Native, don't they automatically qualify for Indian Health Services?
Great question.
Okay.
Yes. So for those of you who are not familiar, and if you didn't hear the question was, don't American Indian and Alaska Native children qualify for coverage through Indian Health Services? The answer is yes. The federal government has long had a responsibility that's been outlined through laws and treaties to provide health care to members of the American Indian or Alaska Native communities. However, that program is so chronically underfunded and care is so sparse that even though this is care that the federal government is providing, if you're only covered by Indian Health Services, they actually count you as being uninsured because they kind of recognize that that care is so limited that it's really not enough and that it's really not meaningful. And so there is a possibility that those 13% of kids are getting covered or are getting care through IHS, but many times kids, even those that are covered by that program, are not able to get the services that they need, which is pretty remarkable. When the federal government is providing you something, but then they're recognizing that, hey, this isn't even enough to get you what you need. Yeah, sure, good question. So again, we can kind of zero in on the 3 counties that we're talking about here today, and all 3 counties have seen a big drop in their uninsured rates since 2008. These are data from the Census Bureau. And I know that here in this region in particular, coverage can be very, very expensive. In some cases, it's the most expensive place in the entire country. And so even though we do have more kids covered, we know that a lot of families are still struggling with that financial burden of being able to afford health coverage. And so we don't want to kind of take our eye off the prize when it comes to that and keep thinking about how we can make health coverage more affordable for kids and families that even still with subsidies through the exchange are having trouble making ends meet and being able to afford those plans. And again, at least for Grand County, we can break down uninsured rates by race and ethnicity. Very similar patterns to what we see at the state level. We see Latino kids in Grand County, about 1 out of 4 lacked health coverage over this 2011 to 2015 time period. Now, some of those years are before federal health care reform went into effect, and so we may have seen a decline in that number since then, but there's a little bit of a lag in the data, especially when you're really zeroing in on these smaller populations, so that we won't be able to see what that impact has been for a couple more years. But I would anticipate that if the numbers may have changed, but just like the state, we would still see that pattern where Latino children are more likely to be uninsured than their white peers. So to shift gears a little bit here from health coverage to kind of maternal and child health, I wanted to talk for a minute about infant mortality rates. Infant mortality rates refer to the death of a baby in the first year of life, and it's oftentimes a reflection of the mother's access to care, the environment that families are living in, and it shows some really interesting and troubling disparities when we break things down by race, but also when we look at race and income. Because I think a lot of the time when we talk about racial disparities in well-being, people think, oh, well, it's not really race, it's just poverty. And because we see higher numbers of kids of color affected by poverty than we do for white children, the poverty just explains everything. And so I wanted to dive into infant mortality for a second to show you why that's not necessarily the case, and that yes, poverty matters, absolutely, but a person's race and ethnicity also has very specific impacts on their health and their education and their opportunity. So this is a graph that shows the infant mortality rate for the state of Colorado broken down by race and ethnicity. We see Hispanic and American Indian babies having a higher than average infant mortality rate, but the rate for African American babies in Colorado is, compared to other racial and ethnic groups, really off the charts. It's much, much higher than it is for kids of other racial and ethnic groups. And so oftentimes, again, people jump to, okay, well, the poverty rate is higher for African American children. Poverty impacts health. That must be what is driving the big difference there. So then when we break things down by race and by income, we can kind of start to poke holes in that argument. So this is a graph that breaks things down even further. So it breaks things down by race and ethnicity. The dark purple bar is the infant mortality rate for white babies. The medium purple is for Latino babies, and the lighter purple is for African American babies in Colorado. And then down along the bottom, you have different income levels. And you can see here that even when we control for a family's income, or this is not on this graph, but when we control for a mother's education level, level, we still see these racial disparities in infant mortality rates. So even middle class African American families in Colorado have an infant mortality rate that is almost as high as the infant mortality rate for an African American family that's living in poverty.
Is this rate per thousand or 10,000?
Great question. Rate per thousand, yes. Rate per thousand, not a percentage, thank goodness. And then you can see, even like if we look at white families at similar incomes, we see that the infant mortality rate is much, much lower. So it really doesn't matter whether you're earning, $75,000 or less than $15,000. The infant mortality rates and those disparities still look very similar. Now, what could be driving this? There's been a lot of research into what is responsible for these disparities, and there was actually a really cool study that was done right here in Colorado that looked at infant mortality rates and that measured cortisol in pregnant women. So cortisol is a stress hormone. It's released when you are in stressful situations. And if it just comes in kind of short bursts and then goes away, it's not as harmful. But when cortisol is present at a high level for a really long time, that can cause some negative health impacts, particularly for pregnant moms. It can result in some adverse pregnancy and birth outcomes. And the study found that cortisol levels were much, much higher for African American women than they were for women of any other race and ethnicity. And it's in line with a lot of other research out there that goes to show that oftentimes people of color are subject to stresses that white people are not. And this stress can, really get into your body in a very significant way so that it can even affect your likelihood of having a healthy pregnancy and a healthy baby. So when we're thinking about a lot of these disparities, again, yes, income matters, but race really matters too when it comes to kids' opportunities and their outcomes. Any questions on child health or anything to add kind of from a Grand County or Jackson County, Routt County perspective? Anything on health insurance? Do you feel like, again, those numbers kind of reflect what you're seeing, or did you think that they would be more even across kids of different races and ethnicities?
Well, as far as the insurance piece, we do have more providers, at least in Grand County, that accept Medicaid now than we did before. As of 3 years ago, you still had to travel out of county for dental care or some health care, so for young children. So at least we have those opportunities here in the county, but it's still the same things I mentioned earlier as far as the distance and the lack of transportation or the cost of the transportation to get to those appointments, and or you're taking a whole day off work to drive to Evergreen to see dental work for your child. So.
And do you think, is there anything you can point to as being, a policy change or a practice change or something that the county has done to attract providers? Like, what do you think is responsible for the increased availability of providers who accept Medicaid? Any ideas?
We have some similar groups that have banded together and said this is a need in our county, and this is, I think, the higher up as far as the county government, as well as working with those nonprofits to bring those opportunities and recognizing that this is something we need to have families stay here and live here and work here.
That's awesome that folks were kind of able to come together and make that happen. Because I think right now in Colorado, almost 50% of kids are covered by Medicaid at some point in the year. And so to not have any providers nearby that are able to provide care would be, really, really a huge barrier to them getting the cover or the care that they need. Okay. Any other thoughts? Katie?
Just a quick question. We talked about health insurance a little bit, and that's obviously a super important benefit that families can use. But have you looked at other benefits like paid time off or family leave or whatever, and looking at those patterns as well, other family benefits?
Yes. So if you look in the report this year, I believe in the health section, we did for the first time include some information about family leave, whether it was unpaid or paid, and then families' ability. So if you get FMLA leave or unpaid leave, that's great, but not everybody can afford to take, months or weeks of unpaid leave. And so the data also look at families who could afford to take that unpaid leave, and we break those down by race and ethnicity too. They're just at the state level because it was, I believe, a national survey that did this, but we do see similar patterns. We see, first of all, a way too low number of families of any races and ethnicities that are able to afford to take that leave. But we do see that fewer African American, fewer Latino families are able to afford to take it than white families. So that is information that we have in there this year.
Are you able to break that data out by like the rural resort community where so many employers, I mean, yes, we have a couple big ones, but the majority are small employers that FMLA doesn't legally apply to?
We're not, unfortunately. It came from, I think, the National Equity Project. And so they just looked at things at a 50-state level kind of, but that is something that we would love to get our hands on for sure. Yes?
Have you been able to, or have you looked at, or is there a connection between the infant mortality and the rates of the family leave, or?
That's a good question. I believe there might be some information in the report on that. I didn't write that section, so I can't speak to that 100%, but I believe there is something about the impact of paid family leave or any form of leave on moms and babies' health. I think you do see lower rates of things like pregnancy-related depression when you have family leave, because obviously moms are able to take the time that they need to recover and bond with their baby, but there may be some more information in there about that too. Other questions? All right, great. Well, the last thing that we'll talk about today is the opportunity gap. And oftentimes this is referred to, and we've referred to it as the achievement gap. And everybody is probably familiar with what the achievement gap data typically look like. So this is an example of something that we might have presented in the past. Fourth graders who are meeting or exceeding expectations in English language arts on the 2016 CMAS, which is the statewide assessment that almost all kids in certain grades take across the state. And historically, and we still see these gaps that exist, again, along racial and ethnic lines. We only have data, again, for Hispanic students and white students in Grand and Routt counties because the State Department of Education has implemented some really strict data suppression rules, and we aren't able to get as good of data as we used to. But these data, again, show that pattern where we see more white students meeting or exceeding expectations in English language arts than we see among Hispanic students, or if we had the state numbers up here, than African American students or American Indian students. Another place where we typically see these gaps is in high school graduation rates. So these are on-time graduation rates by race and ethnicity for Colorado by race and ethnicity, and then for a couple groups here in Grand County where we were able to get the data. And it's not to say that these data aren't important. It is really important to show these gaps in student outcomes, but it's also really important to talk about what's driving those gaps, because if we're going to fix that, if we're going to create a situation where we have high graduation rates, high proficiency levels for all kids, no matter their race and ethnicity, we need to understand the factors that are actually responsible for this problem. And it's a very, very complex issue. We can't ever point to one thing and say, this is responsible for the achievement gap. And this is the simple solution that's going to fix it. But there was a really big study done recently out of Stanford University that looked at the achievement gap. They looked at 300 million data points, which sounds like my own personal dream to have that many numbers in one place, probably most other people's nightmares. But they looked at 300 million data points from all students across the United States who took a standardized test, and they did some fancy math methods to make those tests comparable across states. And they compared those standardized test scores and proficiency levels to lots of other different factors. School level factors like class sizes or teacher experience, student to teacher ratio, community level factors like the percent of parents with a bachelor's degree, the teen birth rate in a community, the percent of people who are living in poverty. And they looked at all these different factors to try to pinpoint, out of all of these different things, what's the best predictor of the achievement gap between students of color and white students. Anybody have a guess as to what was the biggest predictor? What do we often think of when we think of the reasons behind the achievement gap? Poverty.
Maternal education
maternal education. All of these things do play a role, and poverty definitely plays a big role, and kind of in a way was one of the biggest factors that predicted it. But the specific factor that they found that was driving the achievement gap was the difference in the likelihood of attending a high poverty school. So a high poverty school is usually defined as one where at least 75% of students qualify for free and reduced price lunch. Some people use 50%. But in districts where students of color were much more likely to attend a high poverty school than their white peers, the achievement gap between those two students tended to be bigger as well. So it was kind of this component of school segregation, for lack of a better term, that was the biggest predictor of those gaps in achievement. And I think a lot of the time when we think of school segregation, we think that's not an issue now. That's something that we fixed in the 50s with Brown versus Board of Education. And even though we might not have legal segregation by law anymore, due to those kind of housing patterns and differences in where affordable housing is located, we do often still see schools that are segregated, even if it's not a result of intentional laws and policies and practices. And when we have schools that are segregated by race or by income, oftentimes we know that those high poverty schools lack the resources that they need to be able to meet the needs of all students in a classroom. So if you have a classroom of 25 students, 24 of which didn't eat dinner last night or breakfast this morning or don't know where they're going to sleep at night, your challenges as an educator or as a school are going to be very, very different from a school where students are coming from more affluent backgrounds. Yes, sir.
Don't those schools in the high poverty areas have newer teachers and less certified teachers also?
Have you been reading your kids count? Or
No, I grew up on the south side of Chicago.
Yes, you are absolutely right that a lot of the time, and we actually have some data on that for Colorado, a lot of the time the higher poverty schools or the schools that are serving larger groups of students of color have newer or uncertified teachers. And that's not to say that you can't be a new teacher and be effective, you certainly can. But research shows that, like many professions, experience matters. And the more years you've had in the classroom, the more effective you kind of become. And so we'll actually dive into that data right now. I promise I didn't pay him to make that segue. But if we look at the rate at which kids in Colorado attend a high poverty school, again, one that's at least 75% free and reduced lunch, we see that students of color across the state are 6 times as likely to attend a high poverty school as their white peers. And again, these are schools that oftentimes do not have the same resources or all of the resources that they need to be able to get kids performing at grade level. We also looked at schools that are highly segregated, which is defined as at least 75% students of color. And again, we see big disparities here with almost half of African American students and Hispanic students across the state, for example, attending a highly segregated school compared to only 4% of white students. And this shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter the racial or ethnic makeup of your school when it comes to the newness of your teachers or the classes that are offered. But again, when we break down the data, we see that unfortunately schools that are high poverty or those that are serving large numbers of students of color often are at a disadvantage with those things. And so we can take a look at what that looks like. So this graph is comparing highly segregated schools, the purple bar, to schools that are not highly segregated. And just like this gentleman here was mentioning, in highly segregated schools, we see far more first-year teachers, second-year teachers, uncertified teachers than we do in schools that are more integrated. So again, very different resources available to different groups of students. And then if we look at advanced coursework, we know how important things like biology and chemistry and calculus and AP courses are to making sure that when kids go to college, if they choose that route, they are ready to hit the ground running. So it's really discouraging to see that in highly segregated schools in Colorado, they're much less likely to even offer a course in one of those subjects. So we're really depriving many of our kids of the opportunity to even take these classes when they're not offered in these highly segregated schools. Yes, Megan.
Do you think the trend around the teaching staff has the potential to spill into rural schools now as we are facing teacher shortages, as our teachers are aging out of the system through retirement and we're not replenishing that system, especially in rural schools where our pay is so much lower?
That is a great question, and I think absolutely that might spill over. And I think we're seeing that statewide, places that are having a really hard time recruiting teachers, and then they might stay for a year or two, and then they have to leave because they can't afford to live there, or something along those lines. And we also see that, so I didn't break this out here, but I remember when I was crunching these numbers, course access oftentimes rural schools that might be serving large proportions of white students look the same in terms of course access as some of these highly segregated schools. So a lot of these issues that are affecting communities of color and maybe communities of color that live in urban areas are very similar to those that are affecting rural, primarily white areas. So I think that's definitely a concern. And I know there is, I'm not our education person, but I know there is a task force or a committee that's traveling around the state this year looking into the factors behind teacher shortages. I'm not sure if they're coming to Grand County or if they will, but might be something to keep an eye out for.
I think it needs to be looked at from nationally, that teachers aren't paid enough to support a family, and therefore, like in the poverty areas, they can't afford to pay teachers, so you're not getting, I mean, it's just a snowball effect, and teachers are not, I mean, America says they value education, but they don't value educators, as in paying. I mean, we'll pay a sports person millions of dollars and make our teachers poverty people themselves.
Yeah, so when we think
it's a mixed message.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, budgets are really a reflection of our values. And when we're paying teachers, you know, enough that they have to have a second or a third job or work all summer long, that's obviously kind of showing where our values are. So that's definitely something that we've heard a lot from a lot of different places. Yes?
I'm just wondering if your data looked at the flip side of that and looked at the number of children of color that were receiving special education services. Was that a, kind of a mirror image of some of your data here?
That's interesting. I don't remember off the top of my head. I think that I've read before that we do see a higher number of students of color receiving special education, or a higher percentage of students of color receiving special education than their white peers. There are lots of different reasons for that. But I don't know for sure what that disparity looked like. But that is information that I think we have and could get if you want to touch base afterwards. Any other questions or thoughts? Great. Well, we'll just touch on a few other education issues here. One thing that the Children's Campaign focused on a lot this year, particularly when it comes to early education, and many of you may have been involved in this effort as well, was the suspension and expulsion of very young children, so children in pre-K through third grade. A lot of people, probably not you guys, since many of you work in early childhood or work in schools, a lot of people who don't have kids or who don't work in those environments didn't even realize that you could expel a 4-year-old. But of course, as I can see many of you nodding, we all know that that is possible and it does happen. And so the Children's Campaign worked on a bill with many, many other partners this year that would have kind of put some guardrails around when you can use suspensions and expulsions, and also would have provided resources to schools and teachers to make sure that they had what they needed when kids are exhibiting troubling behaviors. Worked on a bill to kind of curb those practices. Unfortunately, it wasn't successful this year. So it's something that we will continue to work on because the data show us some very, very troubling patterns here. This is statewide data, again, that you see here. With something like this, we really didn't want to kind of present district level data because it might be more easily identifiable, especially in smaller communities. But when you do look at these numbers on a district by district level, it's absolutely something that's happening across the state. There are some districts that do it more than others. But I think in the beginning, a lot of people thought, oh, this is just a Denver problem. But when we look at that across the state, it's really a problem that's affecting many, many different types of communities. So this graph here shows the number of children disciplined by demographic group. And again, this is per 1,000 here. In pre-K through third grade by race and ethnicity, gender, and disability status. And even though it says disciplinary actions, we know from these data that 97% of these disciplinary actions were out of school suspensions. So that's primarily what these numbers are reflecting here. And again, you see some very big disparities. So boys, for example, were 5 times more likely to be disciplined than girls were. And then when we look at the racial and ethnic disparities, those are very, very striking, particularly for our young African American boys. And national research shows that the big driver behind these differences is not different behaviors between different groups of children. It's that oftentimes kids of color, and particularly black boys, have harsher disciplinary practices given to them for similar behaviors as other children. And so how many people are familiar with the term implicit bias? Few people. There have been a lot of trainings around that recently. Implicit bias is something that we all have. It's these kind of snap judgments that our brain makes based on information that we get from the media and from society. And it might seem like this very kind of amorphous concept, but there's been a lot of research to show that this implicit bias really is a lot of what is driving these racial and ethnic disparities in discipline. And so when we're thinking about curbing suspensions and expulsions, and in particular correcting these racial and ethnic disparities, there is a lot to be done around at least making people aware of these implicit biases so that you can kind of stop yourself before it starts to impact a kiddo's life. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on very quickly is everybody's favorite topic, school funding. School funding is definitely belongs in the category of inequities. We looked this year in Kids Count at inequities in school funding from district to district and inequities in local property wealth from school district to school district, because here in Colorado, like many places around the state, a lot of our school funding is determined by local property taxes. So if you are a district that has a lot of property wealth, you have the ability to potentially raise more money for your schools than a district that is very property poor. And the fact that we base our school funding on these local property taxes then is very troubling, because we see big inequities in the amount of resources that districts have to tap into. So here in Colorado, if we look at the poorest 20% of school districts as measured by property wealth, and then the 20% of wealthiest school districts, we see 14 times as much wealth per student that these districts have to tap into when they're funding their schools. And this, of course, has been a big conversation around the state for many, many years now. But then why is school funding a racial and ethnic equity issue? Well, when we drill down and look at the numbers, we see that in the poorest fifth of school districts in the state, students of color are overrepresented. 60% of students in the poorest 20% of the districts in the state are students of color. If we look at the wealthiest school districts, white students are overrepresented there. So again, we often have students of color in districts and in schools that are under-resourced compared to schools in other parts of the state. So I know that was a ton of information and a lot of kind of troubling information, and when we went back a long time, and these problems are really complex and they can feel really overwhelming, because none of us in this room was responsible for redlining or for school segregation in the 1950s, but we're all still living with those realities today, and it's really hard to think about what we can do to make things more equitable for our kids. And so I just wanted to leave you with a couple of starting points. I can't stand up here and give you a policy agenda that is going to completely wipe out centuries of racial and ethnic discrimination and segregation, but we as an organization have kind of been on this journey over the last couple of years, and these are just kind of some things that were really helpful for us, and so I wanted to share them with you guys to think about here, about what you can do as a Grand County community or a Jackson County community. So number one, and this is my favorite one, of course, as a data nerd, is just to collect data by race and ethnicity whenever possible. Whether school districts, I think, already have to do this, but whether you're a child care provider or a healthcare provider, if you're collecting data, make sure you're just asking people to check off a box about race and ethnicity and explain why you're doing it, so that you can say, we want to be able to serve families of all races and ethnicities and not have race be a factor in your outcomes, and really tell people about the benefits of collecting the data in this way. And then when you do see disparities, ask yourself why that might be the case, And then ask yourself why 5 more times, because that's usually going to get you a little bit closer to what the root cause of these disparities are. Oftentimes it's not the quickest, simplest answer that comes to us. It often is a systems level or a policy level issue that's driving these gaps in how kids are doing. The second thing you can do is to examine policies through an equity lens using an equity impact analysis. This is a really long, jargony word. It's essentially when you're thinking about policies, whether at the organizational level or the county level, make sure you're really asking yourself, is this going to get us closer to racial and ethnic equity as a community? And if you're interested in diving into this more, you can look at the conclusion in Kids Count, where we lay out some of the questions that you can ask yourself when you're implementing a new policy to make sure that policy changes are not going to exacerbate gaps in how kids are doing. And then when we're thinking about policy development, again, whether that's at the state level or all the way down to the local level, making sure that we have the people who are most impacted by an issue in the room when we're developing a solution, because people who are experiencing something firsthand are always going to be the best experts on what the barriers are and how to fix them, and make a particular effort to include communities of color at the table for discussions from the beginning. And then the last suggestion is just to keep learning. As I mentioned before, I didn't know about redlining before we started this process. This isn't stuff that we're taught in school a lot of the time. And so I mentioned to someone recently, we wrote this report for ourselves as much as for anyone else because we needed to learn about these things in order to be effective advocates for kids and families. And so I've put up some resources here, and we'll send the PowerPoint out afterwards, and it'll have links to all of these things. Some of them are documentaries that are really eye-opening, like Race: The Power of an Illusion is something that was done by PBS. It's really great. And then others are organizations like the Center for Social Inclusion that really focus on helping organizations and communities work more effectively toward equity for kids. So these are just kind of some questions for you to ponder. Maybe at your next community meeting, you can get together and think about, what does this mean for our community? What are some next action steps that we could take, whether that's at the individual level, the organizational level, or at the community level? We hope that the presentation today just kind of gets you thinking about these things.